Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Citrus Bites from our offices in Sevenoaks. Over the next few moments, I'm going to take a brief look at a couple of economic indicators from the last few weeks, have a look at how those indicators may influence some decisions coming up over the next couple of weeks, and as always, I have a couple of questions for today's guest. So I'm going to start today with UK interest rates. So for those that haven't heard, the Bank of England on the 23rd of March announced a further increase to the UK base rate. That was the 11th consecutive increase to the Bank of England base rate, which now stands at 4.25%. It certainly feels a long way from those heady days of 2020 and 2021, when the base rate was just at 0.1%. So the question is, how many more base rates could we be facing into? So to have a look at that, I thought I would start with the latest CPI year-on-year inflation data. So announced for March, that showed inflation slightly down from February's year-on-year number, running at 10.1%, down from 10.4% in February. When you look at that compared to certain other countries, you'll see how much that stands out. For example, compared to France, compared to Germany, Japan, China, where CPI inflation in the UK is unfortunately running ahead of all of those. But for those that aren't familiar with the term CPI, so Consumer Price Index, compared to core inflation, the CPI index includes a couple of items that are really volatile and can influence that inflation number quite heavily. For example, food prices. So we know that food prices just feel like they keep going up and up, but also energy prices, which have been coming down recently. So actually there's another metric for inflation, which gives us that core inflation, which is you take away those really volatile items and have a look at how that's performing. So the core inflation for March came out at 6.2%, which was exactly the same as it was for February. So we know now how the inflation figure is performing. And I guess the question that leads us to is, well, you know, the inflation figure still seems really high. March came in higher than economic forecast. They're expecting a slightly lower figure. So how's it going to look for April? And actually, how much longer can we just carry on seeing that inflation number so high? So the question becomes, how much longer might the inflation performance in the UK carry on in these big double-digit numbers? Well, actually, if you look at the average inflation number compared to the average weekly wage increase over the last few months, what you can see is that inflation is running at almost twice the amount of the average weekly wage increase. And what that tells us is that typically at some point, the purchasing power for us as consumers is going to slow down, indeed, if it hasn't for many already. So one would have to assume that we'll get to a point where you see those inflation numbers start to stabilize or even continue to come down at perhaps a more rapid pace, where our earnings are just losing track against the inflation performance. So it becomes, how quickly might we see that? Because one of the dilemmas with the inflation numbers is that, of course, there's so much in the rear view mirror. So the next set of inflation numbers, which could be absolutely vital in terms of whether interest rates continue to go up for a 12th increase, or actually perhaps stay the same, the next inflation numbers are due out on the 10th of May. Which coincides very helpfully with the next Bank of England meeting on the 11th of May. And I'm sure that those numbers that come out on the 10th will actually play quite an important consideration for the meeting on the 11th to decide what does happen in the end with rates. So that's a brief summary of what's going on with interest rates and inflation in the UK. So what I wanted to do now was introduce today's guest. So a big welcome to Neil Dobson, who's one of our wealth advisors here at Citrus. So thanks for joining us today, Neil. And as always, I'm going to raise a couple of questions with you that we've heard from our clients, some of our clients over the last few weeks at Citrus. So I'm going to start, which perhaps quite topical following the spring statement, which is about the lifetime allowance. There was quite a big announcement in the spring statement, lifetime allowance. And we have had a few clients raise questions about it, but a couple of clients raised a question about, well, why do I need to worry about lifetime allowance? Because surely it's just for the rich. Is that statement true?
Yeah, hi Richard. Thanks very much for that. It's a really, really good question, and a question that I've certainly come across quite a few times. So the LTA was historically set at much higher levels at 1.6 million. It came down a few times until settling at 1 million, and then we ended up with this really strange figure of just over a million, 1,073,000, which was because it was increased by inflation. And people were like, well, that's an awful lot of money. But actually, when it comes to pension planning, it isn't really an awful lot of money, because a lot of people who, for example, work for local government, for one of the blue light forces, they can quite easily get trapped by this. Because when you've got a defined salary or a defined benefit scheme or final salary scheme, the calculation is actually 20 times whatever benefit you would get out of there. So somebody who's got a projected pension of, say, £50,000 a year, because they've worked for the NHS, for example, or for the fire brigade or police for 30 or 40 years, they're already at £1 million, 20 times 50,000. So a lot of those people, especially if they've got other plans in the background, personal plans, for example, can very, very easily fall into the trap of breaching that old lifetime allowance. The government, of course, were really, really keen with particularly the NHS medical services to try and avoid this sort of area where people were disincentivized to stay in those schemes and carry on working for the NHS because they would be breaching this allowance. So that was kind of the main target, but there's lots of people that can very easily fall into that. And so abolishing that really has opened the door up to actually continuing to benefit for longer, to carry on in those schemes for longer, and to continue to build up personal schemes in the background, even if you do retire from those services. So it's definitely not just for the rich. Lots and lots of people will benefit from this.
Great, thanks very much. That's really helpful. Thanks, Neil. And then the second question I wanted to ask you was about life insurance or protection. So a couple of times we've heard this, which is from people who are saying, actually, am I too old? So they've not considered recently kind of life assurance options because they just said, well, actually, I'm probably too old to take out life assurance. So my question would be, can you ever be too old if you're looking at or considering life insurance?
Yeah, great question again, Richard. Thanks for that. So I write an awful lot of life insurance policies, critical illness policies, etc., for our clients. I suppose the short answer is that technically speaking, yes, you can be too old for some providers, but usually the cutoff point is like 85 or thereabouts. And we see an awful lot of people who are, say, between the age of 50 and 70, 75, who have a need for protection for different reasons. Obviously, the younger you are, it tends to be to protect your family, your beneficiaries, to protect your lifestyle, maybe even replace income and things like that. So there's lots of different needs because you're accruing your wealth, you're accruing your estate. But then quite often, as people then reach towards retirement, they've actually built up a lot of value. They want to make sure that their estate, their values, their savings go to the right people at the right time. And actually, we do an awful lot of life insurance policies and things like that where we plan specifically for that reason, and that will be for lots of people who are already way beyond retirement, etc. So really, no, there's always protection. Effectively, is like the foundation, if you like, of any financial planning. So it should always be looked at, no matter what your age.
Great, thank you very much. And also, Neil, so you are the recipient of the very first special question that I get to ask. So we're having a question set now by each guest that joins me is able to set a question for the next guest on Citrus Bites. So Mark joined us last month, and Mark's left a question that I hope you can answer before you get the chance to set the question for the next guest who's going to join me. So the question that Mark left was, what is the most important decision you've made that's impacted your finances to date?
Well, obviously, I've made quite a few financial decisions over the years, but I'm going to have to come back to protection again, surprisingly enough. I've been in a rather unfortunate situation of losing my wife at quite a young age, but I was very fortunate that I'd taken the decision to provide protection for both of us at a young age. So we had life insurance, we had critical illness cover. So when she was taken seriously ill, we had something to fall back on. And frankly, if I hadn't have done that, well, one of the first questions my son asked me at the time was, are we going to lose the house? And, you know, it could have been a very difficult situation. Obviously, it was difficult anyway, but financially speaking, we had those foundations in place. So I would say that's probably the most important thing I've ever done.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Clearly a difficult story, and I'm really sorry to hear that one, but I do appreciate you sharing it with people. Thank you. And also, you get the chance now to set your question for my next guest. So fire away.
Okay, so my question would be, so when thinking about future finances, how far in the future do you look and why?
Brilliant. I'm sure they're really going to enjoy it when they get to hear that one. So thank you very much, Neil. Really appreciate you joining us today. Thank you very much. Thanks as always. Great to have someone, an expert on to provide some really useful updates and answers. So thank you. And that's it for today, everybody. So thank you for joining me for the very latest version of Citrus Bites. Next one to follow again next month. Thanks very much and take care.